Right now, you are being pacified. And the darkest part of this reality is that you are probably thanking them for it. You have been sold a psychological sedative wrapped in a very convincing, socially acceptable package. They call it self-improvement. Read this book. Wake up at this hour. Fix your habits. Stay positive. Just get 1% better every single day. It sounds deeply motivating, doesn't it? But here is the truth that most people will never understand, and the very thing that keeps them trapped in mediocrity. Self-improvement is a scam designed to keep you weak. It is a pacifier handed to you by a society that is absolutely terrified of dangerous, unpredictable men. Why? Because improvement implies that your core foundation is worth keeping. It assumes that the bedrock of your identity just needs a little polish, a little discipline, a fresh coat of paint. But if your foundation is fundamentally average, heavily conditioned, and easily predictable, then everything you build on top of it will inevitably collapse right back into average. You do not need improvement, you need replacement. This is where things get dark. Because to replace yourself, you must first be willing to destroy yourself. Psychological reconstruction is not a peaceful morning routine or a gratitude journal. It is a violent act. The great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung understood this intimately. He warned that society forces every man to construct a persona, a mask designed to make you agreeable, digestible, and completely safe to the masses. You spend your entire life polishing this mask, falsely believing it is who you are. But underneath it lies what Jung called the shadow, the dark reservoir of your repressed instincts, your edge, and your capacity for real power. As long as you are merely improving the persona, you remain a willing slave. To access true psychological dominance, the mask must be shattered. You must look in the mirror and decide that the man staring back at you, the one who hesitates, the one who seeks validation, the one who settles for scraps, is no longer allowed to draw breath. The person you are right now is flawlessly engineered to stay exactly where you are. Stop and think about it. Your reactions are entirely predictable. Your emotional triggers are easily readable. Your decisions are heavily influenced by invisible forces long before you even realize you have made a choice. Because of this, you are effortlessly controlled. The world does not control you by putting a gun to your head or putting you in chains. They control you through your patterns. They control you through your desperate need to remain consistent with the character you have always played. If you want to break this invisible cycle, you must initiate the first phase of your own psychological death. You must kill your script. From the moment you were born, a script was handed to you. It was not written by you. It was not chosen by you. It was installed directly into your mental hardware. Your parents gave you your initial lines. Your environment dictated your tone. Your early failures edited your self-confidence, and your past traumas became the excuses you now recite like a dark religion. How many times have you caught yourself saying, "I'm just not that kind of person," or "I have always been this way," or "I am just not good at confrontation"? Listen to me very carefully. Those are not fundamental truths of the universe. Those are programmed responses. Every time you defend your limitations by claiming, "This is just who I am," you are reciting lines from a script written by people who needed you to be manageable. Predictable men are the easiest targets on earth. When someone knows exactly how you will react to a slight, to a failure, or to an ounce of praise, they do not need to force you to do anything. They simply push the psychological button and watch you perform the trick. That is not living. That is being operated. You believe you are making free choices, but in reality, you are merely reacting from the dusty archives of your memory. Consider Niccolo Machiavelli. In 1512, he lost everything. He was stripped of his political office, accused of conspiracy, imprisoned and subjected to the strappado, a brutal form of torture that dislocated his shoulders. He was exiled to a small, miserable farm outside Florence. Most men would have spent that exile trying to rebuild their old lives. They would have tried to improve their standing or beg for forgiveness. Machiavelli did something terrifying. He let the old, defeated diplomat die in the dirt. He severed his attachment to who he was and, in the deafening silence of his isolation, birthed a completely new entity. He wrote The Prince. He became the immortal strategist of power. He did not improve his past. He replaced his future. Right now, most people are prisoners of their own history. They consult their past to ask for permission on how to act today. They ask, what would I normally do? That is the question of a sheep. A strategist severs the cord. He interrupts the pattern. When the familiar sting of anxiety rises, he observes it and acts in direct opposition to it. When the script demands he apologize for occupying space, he remains silent. You must stop negotiating with your history. Your past possesses absolutely zero authority over your next move, unless you continually hand it the gavel. This transition, from reacting from memory to acting from intention, will feel deeply unnatural at first. Good. Let it feel wrong. That discomfort is the friction of your old self losing its grip on your mind. You do not find yourself in this life. That is another lie sold to the weak. You create yourself, decision by brutal decision. Stop defending your patterns. Stop justifying your hesitations. In the comments below, lock in this psychological shift. Write, I rewrite myself. Because until you realize that you are the author of your own mind, you will always be a prisoner to the roles others have assigned to you, trapped in an environment that has already decided who you are before you even speak a word. Every environment you walk into is an invisible trap, pre-configured long before you arrive. The moment you step into an office, a family gathering, or a room full of strangers, people do not see a blank slate. They see an object to be categorized. Within seconds, their minds assign you a character: the nice guy, the reliable one, the quiet follower, the aggressive one, the harmless pleaser. In psychology, this is closely linked to what is known as the Pygmalion effect, a phenomenon where people project their expectations onto you and through subtle, relentless pressure, force you to reshape your behavior to match their reality. Without realizing it, you begin to alter your posture. You soften your voice. You say what they expect you to say. You stay small purely to keep the peace and remain predictable. This is how you are cast in a play you never auditioned for. And the moment you accept that character, you hand over your autonomy. Once people can define your boundaries, they can anticipate your moves. They know exactly how far they can push you before you break. They know what words to trigger you with, how to make you defensive, and how to make you seek their approval. Most men spend their entire lives performing a script written by others, mistaking social compliance for their actual personality. But this is where everything shifts. The moment you refuse to play your assigned character, a profound discomfort ripples through the environment. People become deeply unsettled. Their predictive models fail. They cannot figure you out, and that confusion is the exact coordinate where your psychological advantage begins. You do not need to walk into a room and dominate loudly. You do not need to shout down others or prove your superiority. True strategic power is silent. You break their expectations simply by disrupting your consistency. When they expect you to explain yourself, you say nothing. When they attempt to provoke an emotional reaction, you remain completely flat, staring through them as if they are made of glass. When they expect you to stay and fight for their validation, you quietly gather your things and walk away without a backward glance. These tiny surgical disruptions smash the psychological cage they have built for you. By withholding the expected reaction, you take control of the interaction. Your silence becomes an insurmountable wall, and while they scramble to fill the emptiness with nervous words, you sit back and study the anatomy of their insecurity. But breaking the social role is impossible if you are still bleeding from your emotional vulnerabilities. This brings us to the next phase of your reconstruction. You must ruthlessly sever your emotional attachments. Most people are bound by thousands of invisible chains. They are not chained to walls. They are chained to outcomes, to the desperate need for recognition, to the opinions of strangers, and to the burning desire to be understood. The moment you care about how someone interprets your actions, you give them a handle to pull. If a manipulator discovers that you cannot bear to be thought of as the bad guy, they will constantly make you feel guilty to extort your labor. If they see that you are hungry for praise, they will withhold it to make you work harder for crumbs. Every emotional dependency you harbor is an invitation for someone else to govern your life. Average lives are structurally unstable because they are anchored to things that can be delayed, denied, or stripped away at a moment's notice. A master strategist builds what the Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius called the inner citadel. This is a psychological fortress constructed deep within the mind, completely insulated from external noise. Inside this citadel, praise cannot inflate you, and insults cannot cut you. You look out at the chaos of the world with absolute detachment. When you operate from this fortress, you remove the leverage others have over you. Imagine how a high-stakes scenario plays out when you are emotionally detached. A colleague tries to undermine you in front of a group, expecting you to become defensive, flustered, or angry. Instead, you look at them with cold, analytical curiosity, as if observing a strange insect. Because there is no emotional fuel to feed on, their provocation dies on the vine. They look weak, and you look untouchable. When someone tries to manipulate you by withholding attention, you do not chase them. You simply lose interest. Detachment is not a state of numbness or passive depression. It is the ultimate manifestation of supreme control. It strips away the emotional fog of fear, urgency, and pride, allowing you to see reality for what it truly is: a chessboard. Anything you cannot walk away from is your master. If you cannot bear the thought of losing a specific relationship, that relationship owns you. If you cannot tolerate the thought of your reputation being damaged by lies, your image owns you. If you are desperate for an immediate payout or instant gratification, your impatience owns you. To become dangerous, you must hold everything lightly. You engage deeply. You execute precisely, but you remain fully prepared to drop it all and walk away if it attempts to compromise your sovereignty. This is the path of the undefined man. You are no longer performing for the applause of an audience that does not care about you anyway. You are positioning yourself for raw, unadulterated leverage. You cut the leash of approval seeking quietly, without a public declaration, without a grand speech. You simply stop showing up to the places where your mind is domesticated. In the comments section below, reject the expectations of the crowd. Write, "I reject all roles." Because once you strip away the labels society has pinned to your chest, you become an enigma. And an enigma is a terrifying opponent. This is where most ambitious men dig their own graves, and they do it with their mouths. The second a new vision crystallizes in their minds, an overwhelming compulsion takes over. They feel an absolute, burning need to announce it. They text their friends, they casually drop hints during conversations, and they post their grand plans across the internet for everyone to consume. It feels highly productive, doesn't it? It feels as though you are finally building momentum. But this is a lethal illusion. By speaking your intentions into the open air, you're actively destroying your capacity to achieve them. In the realm of psychology, researcher Peter Gollwitzer spent years studying what happens when individuals announce their identity-related behavioral intentions to others. The empirical findings are brutal. When you tell someone about your ambitious goals, your brain is neurologically tricked into feeling that the work has already been accomplished. A cheap hit of dopamine floods your system, providing the psychological reward of achievement without you having moved a single millimeter toward the actual objective. The urgency instantly dies. The hunger fades into a comfortable satisfaction. You have fundamentally mistaken the expression of your ambition for the execution of it. Furthermore, the moment you broadcast your plans, you expose your raw, unfinished trajectory to forces entirely outside of your control. You invite unsolicited opinions from people whose minds are fundamentally smaller than yours. You fling open the gates to doubt, subtle mockery, and the insidious energy of those who will smile to your face while silently praying for your downfall. Every ounce of energy you spend managing their reactions, defending your untested ideas, or basking in premature praise is energy stolen from the actual work. A true strategist treats information as a heavily guarded asset, never as a cheap currency to buy social validation. The less the world knows about your trajectory, the less they can interfere with it. Silence is not an absence of action. It is a protective armor. It keeps your vision pure and untouched by the mediocrity of the crowd. There is a fundamental law of power at play here. Never reveal the move before the piece is played. When your enemies, competitors, or even your peers know your direction, they can outmaneuver you. They can block your path or prepare defenses. But when you strike without warning, the impact is devastating. Let them think you are lost. Let them assume you are lazy, unfocused, or stagnant. While they are busy gossiping and performing for one another, you are operating in the shadows. Your results will eventually force their recognition, and results speak with a finality that explanations never can. This brings us to a discipline that modern society has completely abandoned. You must train in absolute isolation. Today, we live in a pathetic culture where everyone demands their transformation be a public spectacle. They document every minor victory, every gym session, every page they read, desperately seeking witnesses to validate their effort. They want someone to pat them on the back and confirm that they are grinding. But this visibility deeply distorts the very nature of your growth. When you know an audience is watching, your focus unconsciously shifts from genuine development to theatrical performance. You stop doing what actually builds lethal underlying skill and start doing what looks impressive to the gallery. Your progress becomes shallow, fragile, and entirely dependent on external applause to sustain it. Real transformation does not demand an audience. In fact, it actively rejects one. Consider the legendary Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi. Toward the end of his life, having survived countless duels to the death and mastered his craft beyond human comprehension, he did not seek out crowds or disciples to applaud his genius. He retreated to the Reigando, a dark, isolated cave in the mountains of Kyushu. Far removed from the validation, praise, or expectations of society, he sat in complete silence and wrote The Book of Five Rings, a masterpiece of martial strategy. Musashi understood that the deepest truths and the highest levels of mastery can only be accessed when you're entirely cut off from the noise of the world. You need a private training ground, a psychological and physical space where no one expects anything from you, where there is no external reward, and where you absolutely cannot fake your progress. In isolation, your discipline is tested in its purest, most brutal form. If you fail, there is no one to offer comforting excuses. If you succeed, There is no one to stroke your ego. There is only you and the ruthless standard you have chosen to enforce. This level of extreme accountability breaks weak men, which is exactly why they avoid the quiet. They need the noise to distract them from their own mediocrity. But for the man willing to endure the silence, it builds a foundation of unshakable substance. When you finally emerge from the dark, the results will speak with a terrifying volume that surprises everyone. People will see the finished product, but they will never know the excruciating, lonely process that built it. They will assume you got lucky, or that it happened overnight, because they were absent for the thousands of silent hours you spent forging yourself into a weapon. Let them wonder. Keep your work sacred. Do not dilute your potential by exposing it to the spotlight prematurely. In the comments below, claim this hidden power. Write, "I build in silence." Most men live their entire lives playing an endless, exhausting game of psychological whack-a-mole. They operate entirely on the surface of reality, reacting purely to events as they occur. If something goes wrong, they panic and try to patch the damage. If someone disrespects them, they flare up in sudden anger. If they experience a sudden stroke of luck, they celebrate as if they actually orchestrated it. They are perpetually tossed around by the waves of circumstance, forever dealing with the immediate consequences of their reality rather than the underlying causes. This is exactly why they remain trapped in unbreakable cycles of failure and frustration. When you only react to surface-level events, you're always late to the battlefield. You're merely fighting symptoms. A master strategist operates on a terrifyingly different frequency. He completely ignores the event itself and looks straight through to the architecture beneath it. He thinks in systems. This requires applying first principles thinking to the dark psychology of human nature. You must stop getting angry at the hands of the clock and start dissecting the gears that turn them. When someone attempts to undermine you, an average man reacts to the insult. A system thinker asks a completely different set of questions. What exact psychological mechanism produced this behavior? What deep-seated insecurity is driving this person's desperate need to lower my status? What is the structural flaw in their ego? When you start viewing human beings not as mysterious, unpredictable creatures, but as complex systems of triggers, insecurities, and conditioned responses, you gain a level of clarity that most people will never possess. You stop taking things personally because you realize that their behavior is not a random attack. It is an automatic output from a highly flawed system. You begin to recognize patterns long before they fully materialize. You notice the microscopic signals that everyone else ignores. A slight shift in a colleague's tone, a repeating inconsistency in a friend's story, a subtle tell in a negotiation. While others are caught completely off guard by a sudden betrayal or failure, you are entirely prepared. You were already adjusting your position 3 moves ago because you saw the system inevitably producing that exact outcome. This is the invisible matrix that 99% of people will never see. And once you open your eyes to it, you can never go back to being blind. You stop relying on the pathetic unreliability of motivation and instead construct ironclad systems that produce inevitable success, completely independent of how you feel on any given morning. You engineer your reality, but you cannot build a flawless system if you allow absolutely anyone to walk in and throw sand into the gears. This brings us to a fundamental shift in how you must navigate the world. Your life is not primarily dictated by how you manage your time. Time management is a corporate illusion for middle managers. Your life is dictated by how you guard your access. Who possesses the keys to your mental space? Who is allowed to interrupt your focus? Most people treat their access as if it is completely worthless. They leave the gates to their mind wide open. Anyone can text them and demand a response. Anyone can call them and derail their afternoon. Anyone can dump their toxic emotional baggage onto them. Weak individuals mistakenly believe that being constantly available makes them likable, reliable, and deeply connected. In reality, it just makes them cheap. The master of power dynamics, Robert Greene, articulated this perfectly in his Laws of Power, specifically concerning the law of scarcity. The more you are seen, heard, and easily accessed, the more common you appear. Over-availability inevitably breeds contempt. When you are always there, always ready to respond, and always willing to engage, people unconsciously begin to devalue you. They treat your time as a limitless commodity that they can spend at their own convenience. Every time you allow a useless interruption, something incredibly valuable is stolen from you. It is not just the 5 minutes of time you lost. It is your momentum, your clarity, and your dominant frame of mind. You become diluted, scattered, and easily knocked off balance. The strategist understands that access to his energy is an exclusive privilege, not a universal right. Not everyone deserves a seat at your table. Most people do not even deserve to be in the room. And once you fully accept this brutal truth, you must begin to heavily filter your existence. You stop replying to messages immediately, conditioning others to respect your delayed response. You stop explaining your absences. You stop feeling that sickening, conditioned guilt for protecting your focus. You enforce distance. You do this with absolute, chilling silence. You do not announce that you are cutting people off. You do not create theatrical drama or send long paragraphs explaining your boundaries. You simply become physically and psychologically scarce. You let the dead weight naturally fall away by starving it of your attention. You reserve your highest level of access exclusively for the things and the very few people that genuinely serve your systemic rise to power. Every time you say yes to a pointless distraction, you are assassinating a piece of your own potential. You must treat your attention like a finite, heavily fortified resource. In the comments below, draw the line in the sand. Write, I control my access. Because if you do not guard the gates of your own mind, I promise you, someone else will gladly move in and rule it for you. This ironclad control over your environment perfectly sets the stage for the final, most dangerous evolution of your new identity. Guarding your physical and digital access protects your time, but there is an even deeper fortress you must secure. You must learn to guard your internal state from being broadcast to the world. Most people bleed vital information without speaking a single syllable. Their face instantly reacts to a disappointment. Their tone shifts an octave higher when they feel insecure. Their body language shrinks when they are challenged, and their emotions leak through every microscopic movement they make. They walk around falsely believing they are in control, but anyone with a predatory eye and a basic understanding of human nature can read them like a cheap pamphlet. Your excitement exposes what you intensely desire. Your frustration exposes what you cannot handle. Your defensiveness exposes what you secretly fear. All of these unfiltered reactions create a highly visible psychological baseline. And once your baseline is established, you become entirely predictable. Predictability is the fatal flaw that most men never recognize until it is too late. Because when someone can accurately read your emotional state, they never have to guess your next move. They already know it. They know exactly when to apply pressure, when to withdraw, when to flatter your ego, and when to completely manipulate your insecurities. They end up understanding your emotional triggers far better than you do yourself. This is why being highly expressive without strict, conscious regulation is not a sign of authenticity. It is a sign of severe vulnerability. It is a constant surrender of leverage. A master strategist understands that ultimate control is not just about the actions you take. It is about the expressions you strategically withhold. You must become completely unreadable. In the dark arts of high-level intelligence interrogations and elite, high-stakes negotiations, Operatives rely heavily on what is known as the blank slate technique. When an interrogator sits across from a target, they do not show anger, they do not show empathy, and they do not show agreement. They become a psychological void, and human nature absolutely despises a void. When you give an opponent nothing to read, they will inevitably panic. They will scramble to fill the uncomfortable silence, and in their desperate attempt to provoke a reaction out of you, they will start projecting their own insecurities, talking too much, and ultimately exposing their true hand. By giving them nothing, you force them to give you everything. You become a black hole that swallows their leverage. When your reactions are entirely regulated, your presence becomes intensely intimidating. People cannot measure how an insult affects you. They cannot determine your next move based on your current state. That complete lack of clarity forces them onto their back foot. They become defensive because they are the ones forced to guess. You do not need to pound your chest or dominate a room with a booming voice to establish authority. You create massive influence simply by limiting what others are allowed to understand about you. A calm, deadpan expression in the middle of a chaotic, highly tense moment sends a far more terrifying message than shouting ever could. It signals ironclad discipline. It signals a man who is entirely detached from the panic of the herd. Becoming unreadable is not about walking around like a lifeless sociopath for the sake of being edgy. It is about lethal precision. You show only what is strategically necessary, and nothing more. You respond when it serves your ultimate purpose, not when a fleeting emotion violently demands a release. Over time, this intense regulation becomes second nature. You stop reacting instantly to the provocations of the world. You observe first. You process in absolute silence. You intentionally select your response rather than having it pulled out of you. The Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl stated that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space lies your power to choose. The average man has no space. His stimulus and response are glued together. The dangerous man stretches that space into an unbridgeable chasm. In the comments below, finalize your psychological armor. Right. I reveal nothing. Now you see the entire board. This was never just a video. It is not motivation. It is not abstract philosophical theory. It is a mirror held up to your deepest flaws. You now stand at the edge of a violent psychological precipice, and you have two distinct choices. You can click away from this screen, go back to your comfortable, distracted life, and carry on with the exact same pathetic patterns, the exact same predictable reactions, and the exact same weak identity that has been secretly controlling your destiny this entire time. Or you can do something that 99% of men will never have the stomach to do. You can execute that version of yourself. Right here. Right now. Remember the fundamental law we established at the beginning. You do not rise by becoming a slightly better, highly polished version of who you currently are. You rise by becoming someone completely unrecognizable. Colder in your systemic thinking, sharper in your ruthless decisions, intensely controlled in your quiet actions, and violently selective in what you allow into your mind. You become completely unreachable to manipulation. This is the dark truth that Niccolo Machiavelli grasped centuries before the poisonous self-help industry ever existed. Power does not come from trying harder. It comes from structural awareness. It comes from total control over yourself before you even attempt to conquer the world. Now that you possess this awareness, the only terrifying question left is, what are you going to do with it? Before you leave this space, take 1 second to decide. If this transmission challenged the fundamental way you view reality, if it made you deeply uncomfortable because it exposed a truth you have been hiding from, then do not just move on like a mindless consumer. Subscribe to the Velvet Dagger. This is not a channel for cheap entertainment. This is the architect's room for your psychological reconstruction. Now, look in that mirror and make the final choice. Which pathetic piece of you needs to die today? The part that desperately seeks applause? The part that blindly reacts to disrespect? The part that endlessly explains itself to people who do not matter? Or the part that stays perfectly predictable just because it feels safe? Choose the victim. And once you have chosen, do not hesitate. Pull the trigger, because average does not slowly fade away with time. It only disappears the exact second you stop feeding it.